systems, everything like that. And people love him and hate him for that, for obvious reasons. But so there's this particular set of bridges on Long Island, like as you leave the city going towards the coast, and there's about 200 of them, that are some of the lowest bridges in the country. You have like a 9-foot clearance, which is really weird. And they still exist. And so like, you and I wouldn't necessarily notice driving through if you're just driving a car through. And so what I'd like you to think about in the back of your mind, so that my metaphor works at the end, is who would notice those bridges and why. What I actually want to start with, though, is some really depressing numbers about the performance gap in higher ed. So this is pretty well-known stuff, but just to add some numbers to what you might vaguely already know about race in higher ed, about 36% of white people overall have degrees, 22% of the Black population, and 15% Latino population. The 6-year graduation rate looks a little bit different, but not very. So once you start college, white and East Asian students, 63% of them graduate within 6 years. Latino, it's 45%, and Black is 38%. The average Black student scores 20% lower on the GRE than a white student, which is actually a wider gap than it is for the ACT or the SAT, which tells you something pretty alarming, which is that it actually gets worse during the course of college, and that we are not magically repairing any of the faults of the unequal public education system. And that's for just all college classes. But to make it specific to online, there's not as much data, of course, about retention rates and race and stuff like that in online learning, but the preliminary data looks pretty bad, that it indicates that online classes might actually make the performance gap worse. So the biggest study so far is, tens of thousands of students, 57 different community colleges, tracking individual students and how they performed in online classes versus in-person classes. And it found that across the board, dropout rates were higher and grades were lower in online courses for the same content for the same student. And that all of those things were magnified for underrepresented students. And they track a bunch of other stuff. Obviously, it's also magnified for first generation and for low-income students, but all of those categories are overlapping things. And then narrowing it down even further to EKU eCampus, we've got about 10% of enrolled eCampus students self-identify as underrepresented minority. And that's about 4.3% Black and like 2.7% Latino, and the rest is a conglomeration of other things. And for the record, 18% of Kentucky is non-white. So we're already kind of tracking below just in terms of who's enrolling. And then our 4-year retention rate for URM students is lower than average, not all that dramatically, but we're certainly not setting any new standards in terms of retention for URM online. And so when you take all of these really depressing numbers, you have like 2 possible conclusions that you can draw. And one is that Black, Latino, South Asian, Indigenous students are just somehow less fit for the college environment and are fundamentally unable to compete. And then the other one is that we are somehow systematically underserving those groups of students. And like, surprise, it's the second one. It's not the first one. If you think it's the first one, I don't know what we can do here. So the rest of the presentation is going to be 2 parts. And the first one is, I think it's really valuable to look at the causes of the performance gap, both on kind of a societal, historical, social level and on an individual level. And then we're going to look at what we can do in our classrooms to address those issues. The history side of it is pretty blunt and obvious. Higher education doesn't serve all groups of students because it wasn't ever built to serve all groups of students. It's been exclusively white and male for the majority of higher education history. It's not until 1954 that colleges are forced to desegregate, and even then, many of them resist well into the 70s. It's not until World War II that most women are allowed to go to most colleges, and even that is spotty, and it's not until 1980 that there's roughly equal numbers of men and women in colleges at all. And that's not even to get into what fields they're going into. That's a whole different game. And that's still reflected in the power structure of higher ed today. So something like 57% of undergraduates are women, but only 26% of upper level administrators are women. Only 13% of upper level administrators are non-white of any category at all. So it's not very surprising that we have kind of a built-in inequality. And then you have to look broader than higher education, and there's this whole other set of just incredibly depressing data about inequality in America based on race. So the median Black household has 7% of the wealth of the median white household, and that gap is getting worse, which is really, really depressing. There's a new study out last week that says by 2024, if things continue as they are, white households will own 99 and 75 times more wealth than their Black and Latino counterparts, respectively. We've also got data that Black families are overall actually downwardly mobile. 7 out of 10 Black kids born in the middle class will statistically end up poorer than their parents. And then we've got things like discrimination in the job market. Job applications associated with Black received names are 50% less likely to receive interviews than white sounding names associated with similar applications. There's also a new study out that does this huge meta-analysis of every one of these kinds of studies they've done. And it says that this number has remained unchanged for the last 25 years. So that whole myth that we're getting better, that old racist people are dying out, let's just let that go. That's not a thing, that's not happening. The wage gap, of course, and we talk about that largely just in terms of gender, but it is obviously an intersectional issue. So the wage gap is magnified for women of color. The worst is Latino women earn 54 cents to the dollar compared to white men. You've also got the criminal justice system. So there's disproportionate sentencing and incarceration rates. Black male defendants are given sentences on average 10% longer than white males being tried for the exact same crimes. There's also the issue of, I mean, this is a huge one. We can't get into all of the criminal justice system right now, but prosecutors are twice as likely to file charges that carry mandatory minimum sentences for Black defendants, all kinds of situations like this. And then the public school system. So it's actually growing more segregated. The percentage of public schools with a student body more than 70% underrepresented has doubled since 2000. And those students are likelier to attend schools where the teachers are substandard. And so, when you take all that together, it feels very unsurprising that we have a performance gap when we're dealing with this level of inequality on the social level. And it also feels very enormous. Like we can't deal with that, all of those things in an individual classroom. So I want to look at some of the data of the performance gap on an individual level, which is largely research about stereotype threat. You guys heard of stereotype threat before? So it's a pretty kind of intuitive concept. The idea is that basically students, when they're reminded of their membership in a vulnerable group, underperform academically. And it started in 1995 with Steele and Arneson, who did a pretty basic experiment where they had high achieving students. I think they're in, I want to say Harvard, but I don't know what it is, who've already been accepted. They have comparable test scores on the ACT and SAT, and they give them all the same tests, Black and white students. And it's actually a verbal section of the GRE. And in one scenario, they just give them the test. In another one, they say, this test is a really accurate measure of how intelligent you are. This tells us how smart you are. And when they said this is a measure of intelligence, Black students did measurably worse, significantly worse than their white counterparts, and significantly worse than if they hadn't said anything at all. And then the other scenario they did was where they just had them do demographic reporting before the test. So like check your race and then take the test. And that also was a stereotype threat condition where the Black students who had checked that they are in fact Black did worse on that test significantly. And so from that study, there's been like hundreds more, literally hundreds more, trying to figure out the mechanisms of stereotype threat. And they all kind of agree that when vulnerable students are put in positions that remind them of their vulnerability or that confirm, they're in danger of confirming a stereotype about their group, they tend to get stressed, they underperform, there's even evidence that they try less hard, have a sense of resignation, so there's even fewer attempted questions in tests under stereotype threat. There's less hours studying if they do these kind of longer drawn out experiments where they assign them the test or assignment and then check back in a week later. And it's not just race. So Black and Latino students, due to all the academic stereotypes about Black and Latino intelligence, tend to do worse on all sorts of academic tests. Women are specifically impacted in STEM fields and business tasks. So women underperform when they're reminded that women are worse at math and science statistically. They underperform when the room is majority male. They underperform when they've had a sexist encounter with a peer. Almost every scenario you can imagine where they're reminded that they are essentially representing women in a difficult field. There's also a corresponding group of research that we're going to talk about how you can mitigate stereotype threat in your classes. But the other kind of set of theories about explaining the performance gaps that I want to talk about is kind of less numbersy. It's not so much about studies and more theoretical, and it's the idea of the culture of power. And this is that idea that I think Lisa Delpit came up with in 1988 first, and it has multiple iterations, of course. But the idea is essentially that there's this unspoken set of rules that are required to participate successfully in the dominant culture. And the dominant culture in the US has been, and will continue to be for some time by all numbers, white, male, heterosexual, able, etc. And so the things that she described as being part of that dominant culture are, every part of a culture. So language, the way you speak, the accent you have, the dialect you speak, your verbiage, everything like that. Etiquette, what's polite and what's rude, how you dress. Do you know what business casual is? Did your parents dress business casual every day? How you react to authority, what your favorite communal ways of learning are, how individual versus how collectively you tend to operate within your community. And so her idea is that essentially these things are really, really important, and that you won't succeed in dominantly white spaces unless you know kind of the keys to how to communicate in the dominant culture, but they're implicit. They're not taught directly. They're the kinds of things you're just supposed to magically learn as you are absorbed into the dominant power structure. And because they're not taught explicitly, they become barriers to people succeeding. And we'll talk more about that also. But so if you take all these things together, there's this unspoken culture of power that excludes underrepresented students, and it negatively affects their self-perception. But this is all me as a white person who's done a lot of research saying this. And so what I wanted to do is take just like 5 or so minutes to watch a little clip from Chimamanda Adichie talking about what her life's encounters with stereotypes have been.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination, they opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this: it saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, living domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature.
Obviously, the whole thing is phenomenal and great, and you should all go listen to the whole thing, because she's wonderful. Has anybody read any of her novels or know who she is? They're fantastic. Purple Hibiscus is the best one. All right. So all of that was hopefully the kind of setup of the problem and the performance gap. And kind of how damaging and widespread that single story is about underrepresented students. So the next half, I want to be about reducing the performance gap and things that we can do. And I want to start from kind of the theoretical things that I'm pulling from and then move into principles and then practices. So theoretically, I think the most widely acknowledged and well-researched set of theories is culturally relevant pedagogy. It's also sometimes called culturally competent pedagogy or culturally responsive teaching, or a variety of acronyms like this. And they all have kind of the same idea, which is that typically in a classroom, you have these underrepresented students or students from non-dominant cultures who have all of these things that they have to get rid of. Things like their accents and their dialects and the ways that they dress that are, seen as abnormal, or all of these different things that they have to get rid of in order to join the culture of power. And the idea of culturally relevant pedagogy is to instead see those as assets that they bring to the classroom and to look instead at the power of their culture rather than just the culture of power. So it's about seeing those students as assets and empowering them and making your classroom as flexible and adaptive as possible to accommodate different cultures. And it kind of emerged again in the early 90s, but then Gloria Gay, I think, is the one who really kind of refined it as a set of guiding principles in 2010. And that's mostly what I'm pulling from, but then we've also got all of the research on reducing stereotype threat, which I mentioned before, and it's just phenomenal. Like, it's even entertaining to look into stereotype threat studies sometimes because it's extended now into athletics. So there's actual studies that show that white men will not jump as high if they are reminded that they are white men before they do a jumping test, which is just wonderful. I just love that. There's also golfing tests where they do, they like, I don't know about golf, they do a round of it, whatever. And if beforehand the white and black participants are told that golf takes a lot of sports intelligence, which is a made-up thing, black golfers do much worse and white golfers do better. If they're told it takes a lot of natural innate athleticism, black golfers do much better and white men do worse. It's crazy. I love it. Anyway, multiple cultures model of instructional design is the last kind of area of theory that I'm pulling from. And I would say overall, there's not a ton of theory about how to deal with multiple cultures in online environments, but this is the leading one. And it basically is, it's more of a criticism of the field of online learning than anything else, where it says that a lot of online instructors and instructional designers have tended to act as if it's a magical race-neutral space when you log on, because you can't see each other and everything is equalized and blah, 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 blah. And so it hasn't really dealt seriously or engaged with issues of race and inequality. And it honestly offers a lot of the similar recommendations that culturally relevant pedagogy does. So what I did was try to take these three branches of research and mash them into a Frankensteinian monster of my own creation, with probably mixed success, and kind of boil it down into three major areas that we can focus on as course builders and as instructors. So the first one is mostly from that stereotype threat research, where you try to reduce the barriers to learning and you try not to trigger stereotype threat. And that's by, getting rid of stereotypical language and assumptions, using gender and race-fair assessments, connecting with existing resources to support students. And then the second part is largely that CRT stuff, so harnessing the power of culture. That's where you try to make sure there's as many different kinds of voices included in your class as you can. You use a variety of learning methods and assessments. You create a genuine social community, and you encourage self-affirmation. That last one is a really big one, actually. And then the last one is largely about that culture of power and how you still have to teach the culture of power if you want to have successful students. So it's about how you can do that without alienating students and still maintaining a value of their culture. It's basic stuff like providing really clear instructions and not relying on assumed knowledge. It's a growth mindset. It's high standards, and it's fostering a broader critical consciousness, which basically means continuing to fight against racism in more sectors than just how you design your syllabus. But what I want to do next, before I get into kind of the details of the research that's on each one of those bullet points, is give you guys a chance to do some exercises. So I have a bunch of activities and discussion board posts and reading lists and stuff from actual EKU courses. All the names and things have been changed. You guys can have a couple. And you guys can have a couple. And so your goal, see how this content could be made more culturally relevant, or if there's nothing wrong with it. But I mean, I chose these, so. And you're encouraged to work in, pairs and talk about what you see. Yes, they are. They're a link in the folder that I sent you. Yeah. Sorry. I feel like you got the math one last time. I changed them up. They're different now. And a couple of these are actually pulled from WKU because my mom works there and she gave me some dirt on people. I stole stuff. Yeah. So in that folder, it's the one called samples for. Yep. Do you want just the link to that one? And if you finish with your glorious examples of teaching excellence, feel free to spread them around and look at other people's. Yeah, right? You've heard that. That's a real one.
Yeah.
Not everybody's foolish enough to put it in their syllabus, but some people are.
Can I read it?
Yeah.
Email policy. All communication in this course will be conducted through our official EKU email account. Facilitator or I will respond within 24, 48 hours during the work week. Please also note you are expected to communicate in a professional manner. Email saying you ain't done nothing wrong or asking me what up will not receive a response. This isn't the hood or the holler. It's the college bathroom.
That's real. That's real. Yeah, that's one of the easiest ones.
I'm overperforming here. I think it also, like, just reading these make me think, like, so often we just share, I mean, in my department, we just share so well, like, oh, you have one for 101, I'm stealing that baby, and I'm like, sometimes you don't even read the whole thing that someone has, you're just like, oh, it's ready to go. And
but that's also a really positive thing in terms of, like, if you were to make a relatively small change in your shared master syllabi, then it could be quickly distributed.
But if there are problems, then it perpetuates
Yes,
that problem.
yes, it absolutely does. Absolutely does. Which one is that? Is that the really hard one? Oh yeah, I think that's super hard. Okay, okay. Which one is that? Number 5. Okay.
Do you know the problem?
Yes.
See the problem on your list. Okay,
Yes.
so I'm gonna try and find it. It's gonna be really hard for that.
It is. It's not
Okay,
fair.
I'll read it. Okay. Besides the fact that it just sounds hard to do, like, I don't know, okay. Based on the information in chapter 4 of our text, describe the best strategy for managing a post-operative client reporting that their prescribed pain control is inadequate. I mean, I know what assumptions automatically come to my mind when I see that question, but anyway. What factors and cues would you use to evaluate their pain level? What are your most important priorities?
Yeah, there's nothing obviously wrong with that one. But what are the assumptions that automatically came to your mind?
It triggers, like, someone's here just to get their pain do that group of people could be equal.
Yes, yes, it does. So you have an issue that is inherently steeped in class issues, if nothing else. But the question doesn't explicitly ask about those. It's just going to let students run wild with that. Which, have you guys all managed online discussion boards? Stuff gets out of hand pretty fast. I don't know. And that one actually, so pain management in particular is an extremely racial issue. So nationally, Black patients receive far less pain treatment than white patients, and it's tied directly to the false beliefs that actual doctors and medical students have. So there was a 2016 study of UVA med students that found that 50% of them openly admit to holding beliefs that are biologically false about Black people, that they have thicker skin and that they are less sensitive to pain, were the two in particular. And then they followed those students and found it's directly tied to how they prescribe pain medication and how they perceive pain in Black patients. So it's clearly a problem in the field. So one of the things that you want to try to do is not just make sure you're not being actively racist and saying things like the hood or the holler, but also look for ways that you can tie your course content to issues of race, if that makes sense. Yeah, that one's super hard. What's the other one that you had?
I mean, it's funny because I read that one, and as soon as I read it, I was like, oh.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
The other one's kind of long.
You don't have to necessarily read the whole thing. You can summarize.
I hadn't finished looking because I was still like, am I supposed to find something deeper than that problem here? This one just feels very like you don't know every detail you're gonna fail this class.
Yeah, so that one is a standards for writing a paper, right?
Yes, standards, guidelines for analytical response papers, and it's like pretty severe. And I didn't read all of it. I can read the rest and find out what.
No, it's okay. Let's do it together because there's not that many people, so we're just gonna kind of.
Do you want me to read it? So the following guidelines are required for every written essay in this course: analytical responses, initial debrief, discussion board, post, literary analysis, and final exam essays. They include formatting, style, and structure. There's a rubric included in the requirements. All papers must be complete. R1, then choose 5 of the remaining 6 R assignments to complete for a grand total of 6. Students should upload a compatible file .docx or RTF when submitting assignments. Do not type or paste your responses into the comment section. I hope I'm not in trouble because so far I said a lot of that. Like, don't do it.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Formatting, MLA style. Do not use a title page in the course. Use the tab key to indent each paragraph. Use a page break to separate the essay from the works cited page. Double space the full document. There should be no extra spaces between paragraphs. Which word includes by default. Each page should have a header with your last name and page number. Use 11-point Garamond font for all work in this course. Margin should be 1 inch all the way around. Oh, well, probably here's the problem: academic and formal writing style. Write in third person unless otherwise directed. Do not use contractions. For example, do not rather than don't. Paragraph properly. Each paragraph should deal with one topic only. Do not use informal language or slang in this course. Spell all words formally and fully. Be objective rather than subjective unless otherwise directed. Cite sources properly. Write grammatically correct sentences that are punctuated properly.
Any immediate thoughts about that?
No, I used to not give very many directions to students, and students cause that.
Yeah.
I mean, they come back to you and say, what are the specifics? How many pages do you want me to write?
Yes. And I think that's valuable. I think being really specific about what you want is actually a part of teaching, the culture of power. I think the question for me when I saw that was about how much assumed knowledge was in there.
Yeah.
So it says don't use third person. What if you don't know what third person is? It says be formal and don't use slang. What if you're not super clear on those differences, or subjective versus objective, or there's even technical knowledge in there. So it mentions tabs and page breaks and headers and margins.
I can imagine like a freshman reading that.
Yeah.
Some schools from Kentucky even.
Yeah.
I don't even know how to use my computer yet. So
Right, exactly. And like that depends on what level course you're in. Like I'm not saying that would always be out of line, but I feel like even in higher level courses, it's not too hard to link to the Purdue OWL writing lab. or to the Knoll Studio. Just if you don't know what these things are, go somewhere else and find out. Okay, do you guys want to talk about yours?
Well, here's one that I don't think either one of us can really figure out what the issue is. It's from a paralegal class. And it's a discussion question. Based on the holding in the Covington case, predict the future outcome of the courts in this case. A woman is driving through Orlando. Her car is stopped by a gang of thugs who demand her purse and jewelry. She refuses, so they beat her car with baseball bats and cost thousands of dollars worth of the thugs have been charged with this crime. What charges are appropriate? What court will this be tried in? Those three replies at 11:59 p.m.
There it is. It's all just one word there. Everything could be fine if you didn't use the word thugs. What does the word thugs conjure up image-wise? Pretty much a black male. There's maybe room for a Latino dude if we're feeling a little bit, but it's pretty much, yeah, pretty much black male. And that's reinforcing all kinds of stereotypes about who perpetrates crimes, who's violent, who's attacking. It's pretty much implied that it's a white woman. They're asking for jewelry. So particularly the dynamic of a thug attacking a white female has like so much loaded cultural weight behind it. There is no need to reinforce that kind of thing. And particularly think if you're a black student trying to write this paralegal scenario, who are you likeliest to identify with in that scenario? Versus if you're a white woman, who are you emotionally identifying with? And the history of the word thug is also crazy. If anybody wants to talk about that, I don't have time right now, but it's fascinating. And it involves the British Empire. Okay, what's your other one? You don't necessarily have to read which one is that? Oh God, you have to read the whole thing. No, that one's so good.
Sorry to be a buzzkill, but I believe that my students deserve and appreciate the truth. There is a reasonable chance that you will not do well in my class or any other for that matter, and it will not be your fault. Be successful in college. It's not enough to be smart and hardworking. Your personal life is a hot mess. There is an outstanding chance that you will fail. Sick kids, unreasonable bosses, abusive husbands, dying parents, grandparents, sick grandmothers, your roommate, friends getting shot in the head, being hospitalized, getting arrested, getting sued, cars that break down. You get the idea. All of these things have prevented student success in the past, and I do not see that changing in the future. So if tragedy strikes you, my experience says that there is a reasonable chance that for this semester, understand that your chances of success have dropped to near zero, and there is nothing to be done about it. There are only two types of students, those who succeed and those who have really good reasons why they don't. You want to be in this successful country. How are you gonna get there?
Shouldn't that just win a prize? That is verbatim, copied and pasted, not a DKU though.
Oh, good. I'm gonna. Oh my goodness. I'm like scared she's gonna pull up on that.
No, you can't accidentally write something like that. So what are the obvious problems with that? Just don't even worry it. If you have a crappy car, just why are you in college? You know, go home. If you have an abusive husband, like, it's outraging. Yeah. And it's clearly states.
You're not gonna make it unless you're just one of those privileged lucky people.
Are your parents paying your rent? Good. Maybe you'll make it. That's about it. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's another one that I just included because I found it. And I was like, that is a 100 level introductory sociology course at a public Kentucky university, not EKU. No. That is real. Fine with that?
I can't believe like someone in their department didn't see that syllabus and be like, come have a little meeting with me.
Well, what'd you say about people don't necessarily read them? He just adds that quietly into the syllabus. Anyway, you guys want to talk about yours?
Yeah, so this is the required reading list for class. First week syllabus, welcome to the course, introductory video. Well, first week, war, these are the books. War is a force that gives us meaning. Chris Hedges, another book, second week, George Orwell, Animal Farm. Stephen Crane, The Red Badge of Courage. These are all required books. Third week, let's see, All Quiet on the Western Front. Everybody knows that one. Ernest Hemingway, A Farewell to Arms. You know that one. Kurt Vonnegut, Slaughterhouse-Five. And fifth week, Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carry. And sixth week, Anthony Swofford, Jarhead, A Marine Chronicle of the Gulf War and Other Battles. That's the reading list.
Every last one of them. It's a course, War and Peace in English Literature is the course. So they're talking about war, and the reading list is all white males. What could that instructor do about that? Try. But the common argument would be, well, most of the famous books in Western literature, and particularly Western literature about war, are written by white males. So how can you get around that?
Make another book famous.
Have them read a not famous book. I know. Having literally had this argument verbatim, I wonder where you guys are going. Start with that.
Yeah, perhaps, or throw it in there.
Yeah, I mean, we argued extensively. That's no longer the reading list for that class. But the basic idea is that it's ridiculous to assume that only men have experienced war in the past ever of human society, and so you can afford to include other voices. Like the Diary of Anne Frank is technically a literature about war that's extremely famous, that it is a young Jewish girl. It's not that hard. Argument.
They can watch Wonder Woman.
Just on a loop. So you already did the email one. Do you guys want to share any particularly good things you had over there?
So I've got one that is PowerPoint slides from a science class with images that are all white male. No, there's one white female. Changing carbs. Yep. So,
Yeah, particularly in STEM fields. I mean, it's one of the most exclusive areas on campuses, and there's actual research that says that it matters hugely. If I think it was 9th and 10th grade science students, and they gave them a chapter out of textbooks to read, and then they took a short quiz on it. And if the chapter included pictures of women, the girls in the class did much better. If it included only men, they did much worse. It's really deep programming stuff that we make assumptions, so a girl taking a science class and seeing only people that don't look like her has some assumptions that she's getting from you about who is supposed to do science. Okay, any other good ones?
I could read the first line of each one of mine. I have 3 of them, maybe you'll get it real quick. The first one is Peter owns a ski lodge for math problems. Second one, Anne takes a taxi home from the airport. 3, Josh is competing in the Tour de France. So all 3 of those, as you read through them, I always think because of our regional services, I think about these kids out of the mountains of Eastern Kentucky. What's a Tour de France? Like,
Yeah.
What is ski lodge? Like, it owns a ski lodge? And then taking a taxi cab from the airport.
Yeah, that's not too hard either. And then the other thing to note there is that it's 2 male names and 1 female name. It's a real common thing to do to just add one of a particular underrepresented group that you're trying to make feel more welcome. That's tokenism, and then there's actual research that says if there's only one, it enhances the effects of stereotype threat, because it's basically saying, remember, there's not very many of you around here. That's not a helpful thing to do. Okay, we should probably move on. If you want more examples, made safely anonymous, let me know, because I've got plenty. Okay, so the next part of this is that handout that I gave you guys. It's like a table, and that was my effort. It's probably a little bit messy, not necessarily super intuitive, to come up with practical things you can do based on this research. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. So the first section is what I just talked about, that reducing barriers thing. So the general idea is that the first thing you have to do is make sure you're doing no harm before you try and like wade into the middle of a culturally relevant classroom. You want to make sure that you're not inadvertently creating stereotype threat situations. So I would say confronting your own internal biases is a really good place to start. Has anybody taken the implicit association test and cried to themselves for a while afterward? Because I've done that. If you haven't taken it, it's a really interesting test designed, I think, by a team of people at Harvard that does, it shows you images of Black and white people, and then you're supposed to associate them really quickly with positive or negative words. And it basically tests the tiny reflex changes that you have for each one. Yeah, implicit association test. And there's ones for gender bias and orientation bias and all kinds of different things now. But the original one was Black and white participants. And it pretty much shows that an overwhelmingly large percentage of white and even Black test takers have negative associations, subconscious negative associations with Black looking faces and Black sounding names. It's a bummer. You should take that, and it's got a whole bunch of resources about where you should go from there. In general, continuing to educate ourselves on race and justice in the classroom, that stuff is important. Managing classroom interactions is a way to reduce barriers. So it turns out a lot of stereotype threat conditions don't come from the teacher, they come from peers. And it's actually your job as an instructor to make sure that your classroom is a relatively safe place even online. So that would include watching your discussion boards really carefully, especially if you're bringing up race explicitly. Expect there to be problematic false beliefs, stereotypes, all kinds of things, and you have to watch that and you have to challenge that. I know a lot of instructors that feel very awkward or uncertain about boundaries of free speech and the kinds of places where you should delete a comment or you should step in. I would advocate for a pretty hands-on approach. I've definitely deleted comments. I just recently found out that you can delete comments on your own Facebook page off your posts. It's great. If you guys didn't know you could do that, it's fantastic. Part of managing the DBs is putting explicit guidelines out there. So the other thing I handed out is the netiquette guidelines that I use in my courses. And whatever version you use should probably explicitly mention race, gender, orientation, ability, all the different ways that people can perpetuate stereotypes. And partly that's so that you have a document that says, well, you broke the code of our discussion boards and that's why I'm intervening. And partly it's because it sends a message before they ever post that you have a fairly safe classroom space. Obviously, with reducing barriers, a lot of the exercises we just talked about are watching stereotypical depictions that might have cropped up either in the textbook or in your word problems or in your tests anywhere. You want to frame tasks and tests in gender and race fair language. So that's a very specific thing that stereotype threat research has come up with, where if you explicitly tell students, yes, overall women underperform on math tests compared to men, but this test is fair, even if that test is not fair, they do equally well. It kind of undercuts the effects of stereotype threat. Also, there's even evidence that if you just explain what stereotype threat is before taking a test or turning in an assignment, they will also do better, because it's kind of arming with them to be aware of kind of the traps that their subconscious is setting for them. And then the other thing, and I think it's mentioned on that handout, is that the other barriers that students are facing are financial and the lack of academic preparedness, and there are institutional resources that you can connect them with. There's, I think, a link to specifically URM-focused scholarships in particular. And then the second page is kind of the meat of the thing, and that's about culturally relevant pedagogy and harnessing the power of culture. First thing that seems to have a research-backed effect is that you need to communicate that diversity matters to you and that you value all students. One simple way is to include a diversity statement on your syllabus. It's small, it's probably not that impactful, but it matters particularly to a student who is feeling threatened or uncertain in their class. They're reading through a syllabus and see that. And then the other way you communicate that it matters is that you explicitly teach it. Like we were talking about that pain question, there are ways in almost every field that I can think of to tie issues of race, ethnicity, inequality into your content. And if you're teaching that, there's evidence that students whose teachers talk explicitly about racism are all much more aware that racism exists. And for students of color, they're actually, it seems to give them some kind of buffer when they experience actual discrimination or racism in the classroom setting, that they have kind of a way of processing it, and they don't seem to show the academic and mental health negative outcomes that happen if they don't have a teacher who explicitly talks about racism. Including diverse representation. So after you've removed the awful stereotypes, you want to make sure that you have equal, fair, diverse representation in every aspect of your course. So the textbook, the readings, the images you use, the videos you show, make sure there's an actual diversity of voices there. I'm particularly looking for ones that counter stereotypes. So female engineers, people of color who are scholars, like, you know, things that are explicitly pushing back. I think that's really valuable. And specifically look for empowering content. So not just do these people exist, but positive role models for you and students. So they did another study where they had people read really short, like Wikipedia style articles about different, I think it was successful athletes or something. And girls who read about just one successful female athlete before taking an unrelated test did better on that test. I have 5 minutes? Okay. What else do we have? Valuing students' cultures. This is a lot in how you are framing your assignments. So if you allow a personal experience to come in, you're kind of sending the message that you value their cultures and their experiences, and it's welcome in their classroom, and they don't have to do that thing where they leave all of their native experiences at the door. If you allow linguistic freedom and informal writing and teach code switching explicitly, that's really, really helpful. So not just like, you know, this isn't the hood or the holler, but there's one way you talk, and then there's the way we talk in academics, and you need to learn this. Explicitly asking for identity-based or cultural self-reflection early in the class is a good idea. Journal assignments are great for that. Flexibility and variety, you guys already kind of know this. It's just a principle of good teaching that you have multiple forms of teaching and you have multiple forms of assessing. That works especially for students who come from cultures that learn in different ways than the dominant culture. Encouraging self-affirmation. If you want to go down an awesome rabbit hole, just Google self-affirmation education studies. It's a new field and it's really, really exciting. It's things like they had a bunch of high school freshmen, black and white, do a quick self-affirmation study exercise. It was like 15 minutes at the beginning of the school year. They just wrote about like what they think their strongest skills are and how they think it's going to help them during the year or something like that. And by the end of the school year, the racial gap for students who had done that self-affirmation exercise was closed by 40%. It's like a huge effect for such a tiny exercise. And the same is true, they did it with college freshmen incoming, black incoming freshmen, did a 1-hour session that was focused on belonging in the college environment. Like, you belong here, here's this long history of black scholars who come here, blah, 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 blah. 4 years later, the racial achievement gap was closed by 50% for students who've done that. So self-affirmation is a huge thing. Social connections seem to matter a lot. Group assignments, even though we all hate them, seem to actually help underrepresented students succeed. And then opportunities for ungraded social contact, to just make contact with their peers, seem to help. And then the last part of this on the final page is teaching the culture of power explicitly, because you do want to do that. So that's where you provide very clear expectations. You describe the writing and language things. You avoid academic ease, especially on rubrics where it's like how they're going to be measured. You promote a growth mindset. If you haven't heard of that kind of phrase, it's basically if you promote the idea that students can get more intelligent over time and learn more, they are actually more able to do that. The same is true of yourself, by the way. You can actually change your IQ if you just believe that you can versus if you can't. and then it stays stable. Maintaining and communicating high standards is a huge one. Wise feedback is a whole nother area of research where the single most effective piece of feedback you can give is essentially, I have really high standards, but I think that you can meet them. Those two things together apparently just are magical, because they did a whole big study in college students and they gave them their papers back. It was their first draft, and the ones that had all positive and all negative comments didn't get nearly as good of results as the one that was, I have high standards and I think you can improve this paper to meet those standards. Students were likelier to turn in a second draft and likelier to change it substantially. Part of those high standards is to really, really, really never give pity points. There are studies that actually show that white teachers are likely to score easier for Black and other underrepresented students, and that is a huge problem. They're also likely to give less feedback. So you're just kind of passing them because you're like, oh, I'm a nice white liberal teacher and I want to make sure you guys go far in life. That is terrible. You're not teaching. It's also part of the trust gap. So there's lots of research that says Black students don't trust white teachers to evaluate them fairly. And then beyond that, you just want to foster a broader critical consciousness. Culturally relevant pedagogy is worth nothing if you're not actually trying to make a more just society. Things that we could do in terms of big dreams that I have for EKU. You need more underrepresented faculty, more instructional designers like me, more non-white students. You need potentially mandatory training, may I suggest it? And then building it into actual teaching evaluations is something that I'm really interested in. And to finish up our story with these bridges, have you guys thought about who would notice these weird, low, 9-foot-tall bridges in Long Island? So several of you have seen this before.
People that drive different cars.
Big trucks, absolutely. What other kind of vehicle is too big to go into that? School buses and city buses. So after Robert Moses died, his papers were found, and he intentionally built these bridges too low for inner city buses to get out of the city and take Black residents to the beaches. He built all these beautiful beach parks. He didn't want to mess up. He believed in segregation, so he built it into the landscape. And that to me is A, horrifying, but B, important, because when you're a member of the dominant culture, you don't always see the barriers to success. So part of what we're learning to do is see those barriers and hopefully dismantle them, which they haven't yet. Those still exist. I can share with you a link to a whole bunch of resources. There's a Google Drive folder that has this and the netiquette standards and that handout, and a lot of bibliography if you guys want that. Thank you guys so much. Sorry, I didn't leave enough time for questions. Did I finish almost in time?
That's going to be in our course, or you said it's online, but like where do you mean that?
I'll send you guys a link if you want. It's in my Google Drive folder, a shared open Google Drive folder.
Okay. So someone else.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we'll get that.
Yes.
Good.
Thank you.
So we're particularly interested in the references.
Yeah.